You can get Sons of Patriarchy completely ad-free on Apple Podcasts for $4.99 per month or $44.99 per year. This applies to our entire back catalog and every upcoming episode completely ad-free. Listening without interruption. If you don't mind the ads, you can still listen to the series for free on any of your favorite podcast platforms. This revenue helps support Outreach Idaho and helps pay the bills of the series. Now, on to the episode. Quick announcement before we start this episode. We've launched our website and initial line of merch. Go to sonsofpatriarchy.com and pick up a t-shirt, a sticker, or a crew neck fleece, or all three. And wait till you see our design. We went bold. A link to the website is in our show notes, or simply type sonsofpatriarchy.com into your search bar. Now, on with today's conversation. All right, so we have another person coming on who has been reporting on church abuse and abuse in the church in general. So we'll talk to her about all of these things and not just the research behind this, but then how do we get it known? And then how do we start litigating this? How do we get eyes on this and ears on this so people make changes? So if you can introduce yourself and how people might have heard about you or know about you, and then we'll get into the first question after that.
Sure. My name is Julie Roys, and I'm the founder of the Roys Report, which is an independent Christian news site reporting on abuse and corruption within the church. We've been doing it since really 2019 and have been absolutely inundated with the amount of stories and leads that people bring to us wanting us to report on. So it's kept me pretty busy and certainly given us a certain amount of visibility within the evangelical space. I think last year we had like 10 million views. This year we're on par with that. We're exceeding that this year. So I mean, we have just been growing and growing and growing as more and more of these scandals and abuse come out.
Yeah. I feel like you've been around for longer, but that's may just be because there's been so much more abuse, or I guess we've been reporting on it, or it's been showcased more recently, I guess, with social media and everything else, or people just being more bold in general. So 5 years old, how did you get into church reporting in the first place? I think your background is in journalism. I know you got your degrees in journalism before.
Mm-hmm.
How did you one day decide, you know what, I'm gonna start pursuing church reporting now?
Well, I mean, in college, I really wrestled between going into journalism, or I should say after college. Like my senior year, I ended up taking this intro to journalism course. I went to Wheaton College where
Okay.
it was too liberal artsy to actually have a journalism major. So
Yeah.
I took that course. I ended up being the editor of the campus newspaper and found myself nosing, putting my nose where people didn't appreciate it, but things that needed to be reporting. And I found that there was this backlash and this cover up, and I was like, oh my goodness, is this how things operate? And it kind of tripped my justice meter. I still struggle with, do I want to go into ministry or do I want to do journalism? And I also got married and became a mom. So, I mean, I've done all these things, but I did get trained because honestly, I remember I got accepted into seminary
Hmm.
and into Northwestern University in Evanston, the Medill School, which is one of the top journalism schools. And I remember my mother saying, Julie, you're going to be so frustrated in seminary because I'll spend an entire class period arguing about a Greek word, and you're such an activist. You are not cut out for that. Plus, as a woman, we're talking late 80s, there weren't a lot of opportunities for women in ministry. So I ended up going into reporting, but I also ended up taking 13 years off to raise kids because that's priority for me. But I did end up working at the Moody Bible Institute.
Mhm.
I remember this is on, again, I had been out of doing anything for about 13 years, but went in because I felt like God gave me a green light to began working outside the home again, and I ended up getting hired to produce the morning show.
Hmm.
And so I did that for a little bit. I only lasted about 6 months, and then I was able to carve out a place doing more features and commentaries for them. And then I pitched to them doing a radio program called Up for Debate, because I noticed that people would call Moody all the time and they'd be like, "What's a Moody position on this?" And I'd be like, seriously, like, do you not discern for yourself? Like, what if the Moody position is wrong?
Hmm.
And so we did a program called Up for Debate, where I would bring on people from both sides of a controversial issue, like take the Christian gay movement. I mean, is that legit? And we did some pretty edgy things, especially for the Moody Bible Institute. But I would get guests on both sides of an issue, and for an hour, I'd sort of moderate that debate. But it was during that time that I began to see things, and began to notice things. And it led to sort of a crisis of conscience for me. I began to see what Skye Jethani, I believe, termed the evangelical industrial complex. Skye, of course, is a pastor, an author, a writer. He also used to be an editor for Christianity Today. But what he realized is there's this entire business, this entire industry in evangelicalism that's built up around and really supported by celebrity preachers. And so you have your publishing houses who rely on the big name to make money for publishing their books, the conferences, the radio programs. We would always have, the big name pastors on our shows, and we'd promote their books, or have them talk about their latest book. And then, of course, the mega churches, and then these huge ministries that are named after, like Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. I mean, all of these things where when somebody gets in trouble, instead of Christians doing what we're supposed to do, which is holding each other accountable, they would cover for each other because they're all making money on each other. And I began to become very disenchanted with this, even as I'm on the inside and a part of it,
Hmm.
because I had just published my first book. I remember I was going to be one of the MCs at Founders Week, which is this huge conference that Moody does every year. I was scheduled, on all these radio programs. I mean, all this stuff. At the same time, I'm realizing this is kind of gross, what I'm seeing. And I felt like it really came to a head when I realized that, for example, the president of the Moody Bible Institute had taken a $500,000 loan to buy $1 million condo, and that $500,000 loan was from the Institute. So that's kind of a red flag, considered kind of a no-no by the IRS to be it's often called self-dealing. But really it came to a head when a professor came to me, and I realized there were like 30 or 40 professors who had written letters to the Concerns Committee talking about a culture of intimidation and silencing within the Institute. And these are professors who really were concerned about mission drift, and when they would bring something legitimate to administration, instead of the issue being dealt with, they would get gaslit, or they would get reprimanded, or they would get a letter in their file, these sorts of things. And so I tried all the legitimate, and this is what I find in my reporting, people try all the legitimate avenues that they know of. I went to the trustees, because I thought, if I bring this to the trustees, they'll do something.
Hmm.
And so that was my first impulse. But before I did that, I got because I was trained in journalism. I got recordings of, people, firsthand witnesses. I got documentation. I got everything on the record. And then I went to them and said, this is what's happening. And they told me, I remember it was just two of the trustees, and I flew out there on my own dime, had another guy come out with me too. So I had a little bit of support and also a witness. And they said, I want to get you on the phone with the chairman of the board. And he said, I'm sure that the chairman of the board will be concerned about these things. And the next day I got on a call with chairman of the board. Of course, I had a witness on that call as well. And as I brought these things up, I realized that he was the one that had arranged this whole loan, the $500,000 loan to buy the $1 million condo. And as we're talking, he says to me, Julie, just so you know, Paul Nyquist, who was the president of Moody at the time, he knows that we're talking. He knows what you've done. And I was like, are you threatening me?
Hmm.
is that what's happening here? And so, and so I realized before too long that it wasn't just an administration problem. It was a trustee problem. It was a systemic problem. And so it really came down to a crisis of conscience. I ended up publishing, and I figured when I published what I knew, it would be the absolute end of my career. And I was fully prepared for that. Within 24 hours, the president was resigned, the chief operating officer resigned, the provost retired. I think it was the official
Mhm.
position. Although then he got another job at Wheaton College shortly after that. But everything I said, everything I reported was true, and they knew that. But even so, I broke that code, which is you don't speak of these things. You don't publicly expose what's going on. We keep this all in house. And so I was fired as well. And again, I thought, this is fine. I will go back to raising, you know, at this point I was about to have grandkids, and I was like, that's fine. I'll spend time with my grandkids and I'll have more time with my kids. This will be great. And on the heels of that, I was not prepared for the people who came forward begging me to do what I had done at Moody, now to where there was abuse and corruption. So that really is what started the Roy's report. And the next story out of the gate was about Harvest Bible Chapel and James McDonald, which um,
Huh.
ended up being quite the saga. They
Yep.
sued me before I published a single word when they realized that it was an attempt at prior restraint. So they sued me, and which really was a gift come early, Christmas come early, I often say, because now I had subpoena power and I knew
Hmm.
where the bodies were buried. And so
Yep.
I started
Yep.
subpoenaing. I got all sorts of information. And the minute they found that the gag order they tried to put on me wouldn't work, they dropped that. They dropped that lawsuit. But again, it led to James McDonald got fired. All the elders ended up resigning. The evil was exposed, but I thought at first it would be, there's several bad actors and we'll expose them, and then we can get back to doing the business of the church, right? Although I say business of the church, really, I found out it was way too much the business of the church. And I found out that the rabbit hole just keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper. And the corruption and abuse is far more extensive than I would have thought. And so we started at that point asking if people would support this. It's been a
Hmm.
completely grassroots supported effort. Every year we get more funds. Every year I'm able to hire more reporters and get more staff. And I really do believe this is a move of God to purify his church.
Hmm.
And so I'm just trying to be faithful. And it doesn't make you real popular to be the bearer of bad
It does
news.
not. No.
but that's my job right now, and I'm trying to be faithful to it. And unfortunately, I'm just way more busy than I wish I was.
Yeah. All right. So there's a story. Now let's kind of go behind it and how these abuse stories get out, how you get the materials for it, who you talk to.
Mhm,
Um, and so coming into this episode, it'll be you and Rachel. And Rachel's you can call her the whistleblower, the one who kind of first came out,
mhm.
I guess, most publicly on some of these things too, mostly on the gymnastics or secular side, and
Yeah.
also within the SBC. So let's talk about reporting on abuse in general. So I'll ask three consecutive questions, and feel free to answer them in any
Mhm,
way that you want to. What goes into reporting on abuse? Because I think some people think it's just kind of simple. Like you get the report and then you publish it. What are the interviews like? And then you said this towards the end of what you just introduced. How are your reports generally received,
mhm,
both positively and negatively? Because I think that might come as a surprise to many. It's not just like you come out as a survivor and bam, you're famous. It's not quite that simple. And then how have you seen that this has helped those whom you've exposed have hurt?
mhm.
How it's helped them?
Sure. Well, investigative reporting or reporting on abuse is really just applying the reporting skills that you have to more longer in-depth pieces that you have more time hopefully to do, and working with survivors and with people who've experienced trauma. So it involves often. Uh, it often involves being trauma informed
Mhm.
and being sensitive to someone who has been through a very traumatic event. And you have to understand when they're telling you about the trauma, they're reliving it
Yep,
often.
very
And
much so.
and so understanding trauma has become extremely important. Again, I didn't I didn't intend to get in this space. It just kind of happened.
Yeah.
I was just trying to be faithful with people that would come forward to me
Yep.
with stories. And I found I encountered more and more and more abuse survivors. And honestly, survivors have been my best teachers. They have helped me understand what trauma is and what they go through. And so when we interview someone, uh, it's often really important to and you really have to bend over backwards to make them feel safe,
Yep.
that this is a safe place. You need to explain everything that you do. I do this with everybody pretty much that when I do my reporting, I usually ask them if I can record.
Hmm.
Then we'll get on a recording and then I'll say again, is it okay if I record?
Yep.
Because I've had people I've recorded who then have said, I never gave her permission for anything. And so I've learned you record everything. But then I go over everything. This is what off the record is. Off the record means, or on the record means I can report what you say to you by name. Off the record means I can report what you tell me. I just can't attribute it to you by name.
Hmm.
Background means I can't report what you tell me, even if I don't attribute it to you by name. You're simply telling me where the bodies are buried so I can go and do some digging.
Yep.
And I'll ask if they have any questions about it and we'll go over it. And honestly, by the time we get to that point with a survivor, especially with a very sensitive story, I've usually had at least one, but often numerous conversations leading up to that point.
Yep. Big
Because
time. Yep.
they are not going to go on the record with me till they feel they can trust me, till they feel that I'm
Oh
safe.
yeah.
And of course, that took a lot more in the early days than it does now. Now I have people coming and they're like, Julie, I want you to tell my story. I've researched you. I like your reporting. I know you're fair. I know you're thorough and you do your homework. And there's change because of it, and there's an impact. So I feel like now we have that reputation, but I still go over all of that, and I still answer. Usually, the first conversations I have with a survivor is, um, "I bet you have some questions for me. So what can I
Hmm.
answer?" And I let them interview me, and
Hmm.
I answer those questions. But again, I find explaining the whole process, and then when we get into the actual interview, it's pausing, it's giving them space. Sometimes they're going to take a long break, and you just let them take a long break.
Yep.
It's checking in with them. How you doing? Are you doing okay? Hey, we can take a break if you want. Um, it's really monitoring how they're feeling in the moment, making sure they're okay and giving them space. And understanding, though, that just hearing their story and not responding with, you know, the kind of questions they're used to, like, why were you there?
Yeah.
What were you wearing? What did you
Mm.
do? Did
Are you
you
sure
not
this
rate? I mean,
happened? Is this not just discipline?
exactly. To have a compassionate voice on the other end. And I'll be honest, some of these stories like wreck you
Oh yeah.
emotionally.
Oh yeah.
And so it's really bottom line, it's loving people. And I have not found that there is a single source that I can't love or I can't care for. And I feel, especially as a Christian, it's caring for them in that moment. Like, really, what does this person need? And how can I, minister to them? At the same time, staying professional, and keeping a certain amount of distance. But at the same time, they have gone through so much and they have had so many people discount or dismiss their experience. And so just to be that faithful presence and to be that listener can be healing for them. And so that's what I try to do. And through the whole process, I try to give them power,
Mhm.
because that's the thing. If you've been abused, somebody took agency away from you. They used their power to take something from you, to prey on you and exploit you. So what I want them to do is have the reverse of that in this experience with me. I want them to feel you're in control of your story. I never pressure people to go on the record.
Hmm.
You know, if a survivor, I'm like, it is up to you. It is up to you if I use your name or not. If
Hmm.
it's a sexual abuse survivor, because of the nature of the crime, that is the one. We're very, very careful about using anonymous sources. In fact, this is about the only time we'll do it is if we have a sex abuse survivor, again, because of the nature of the crime. But I'll tell them, this is completely up to you. And I'll have some of them say, oh, no, I want you to use my name.
Big time. Yep.
This is important to me. And I'll say, absolutely, but that's your choice,
Yep.
completely your choice. So that's, I mean, that's kind of the process. And then after the interview, I like to check in with them like the next day. You know, how are you doing? You doing okay today? I bet that took a lot out of you, you know, like just kind of trying to
Reliving all
see.
the stuff that you just went through.
Right. And of course it depends. You know, some people's stories are more traumatic than others for
Sure.
sure. Some people I don't check in with because they're fine and I can tell they're fine. But especially if it, you know, you can tell after you've been through these interviews, you know, if it was traumatic for the person to redo. And this is the thing I always say to them is I would hate for you to go through this process and there not be, you know, there not be some benefit to you because that's there, you know, it's like somebody said to me, I'm going to go out there and bleed, you know, and it's asking so much of them. And this is something that truly makes me angry is that reform in the church, holding these abusers and these predators accountable requires the person who's been abused. It almost always lands on them to do the heavy lifting. And
Hmm.
it shouldn't be that way. But it's very rare that other people come alongside them and say, how can we help you? What can we do for you? It's usually, and usually by the time they get to me, I'm their last resort. They've tried everything else and nobody's listened to them. And so I take it super, super seriously. I take stewarding their story super seriously. And I think one thing that we've learned, I think from the Me Too reporting and the Church Too reporting, and this is why I say, um, I, I love that there are people going out there on social media and telling their story if they want to.
Hmm.
And using, you know, I mean, anybody can launch a blog and tell a story. But the one thing I'm always concerned about is that when you do that, you don't have a professional who's used to investigating, trying to corroborate your story. And that's one of the things I try to do for these victims and these survivors is to say, like, whenever they'll tell me about something that happened, I said, did anybody witness that? Did you tell anybody about that? Do you have any texts? Do you have any emails? Do you have so my job then as a reporter is to go down every single avenue I can, talk to every person that I can, and get as much corroboration of their story as they can. And honestly, to this day, people will say to me, well, how do you know they're not lying? Well, for one, studies show us that women don't generally lie by saying that somebody sexually abused them.
Yeah.
They usually have there is no benefit to them for telling their story. And so we know that 90% of them are telling the truth in these abuse stories, and usually at great cost and personal risk to themselves. But I will say, even though it's my job as a reporter, and I'll say to them, now you understand, I'm going to have to talk to so and see what, you know, I have to go to the accused. I'm going to have to get their side of the story. You understand that's my job. And they do, they understand, but it's also my job to corroborate their story and to do all that. But there's safety in that because when I'm reporting a story, I'm not just reporting their account. I'm reporting a story that I've vetted, that I've corroborated, and now I'm bringing to the public. And so I think that's super important. And I think this is why we see an increase of survivors going to reporters to tell their story. So you know, that I just got an email today, and I want to just read it to you because
Please do.
it was so powerful. We had just published a story of an abuser who was abused over 20 years ago, and her abuser is still in ministry.
Hmm.
We reported the story, and the reporter was Rebecca Hopkins, one of just, and we have the most outstanding reporters, and they don't get paid nearly what they deserve to get paid. They really do this because our heart's in it. But Rebecca reported this story, and the survivor whose story we reported, she reached out and she wrote me this letter. And she said, I wanted to write and just say a few things about Rebecca Hopkins. She is pure gold. From my very first interaction with her to the release of the story, she made a very complicated and vulnerable process bearable. She was compassionate, attentive, and honoring towards me, and went above and beyond with my questions about the process, communication, and care. I just want you to know that. Having her on the front lines of reporting stories like mine is so very important, especially with the content that you were reporting on. She is amazing. Those stories mean a ton to us because we always want to feel like that survivor feels like we have stewarded her story or his story well and have done an outstanding job with bringing it to the public professionally, but also compassionately.
Yeah, that's that's all really helpful background information on how some of these things work. Because I think, and maybe this is just the surface level prevailing opinion, but I think most are just, I think most think when a survivor comes and tells a story, they can't wait to tell their story and bring the accuser down and have this, like, see their name in the news. I think that's what people think happens. But of the people I've talked to, and I know the people you've talked to, and I'm not going to say I coax them, but it's not, generally speaking, they're excited to tell their story. They're like, you know what? Nobody's ever believed me, and I don't know why people are going to believe me now, but I'll still tell you my story. And they're not really sure what's going to happen. If anything, they're like, nothing good is going to happen out of this story. But I've never heard of somebody who's asked or told their story because they've been excited to do so and excited to take the person down, even though they want to see the person taken down. It's been years, and they're like, well, of course that's not going to happen because it hasn't happened up until now.
No, you're asking them to recount the most horrific event in their life, usually. And they're not eager to do it. And the only reason they do it, usually, one of the reasons, main reason, is because that person is still out there abusing and they know
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Because rarely are there one-offs in this. Abusers are abusers and they keep abusing till somebody stops them. And
Hmm.
so they really do this out of care and concern for other potential victims or other victims. And sometimes you'll have several victims come forward at once and they're all in communication with each other and supporting each other. So that often helps. I mean, man, if you can have a community come forward with you, that's phenomenal and that's
Yeah.
wonderful. Very rarely does that happen, but it does happen. The International House of Prayer, for example, when we reported on that, I mean, that was one where there was a great deal of support and a great
Mm.
deal of, advocates out there that were there for them. But yeah, nobody wants to tell their story. I've never had somebody eager, and if somebody came to me eager to tell their story, I'd be a little suspicious, to be
Yeah,
honest.
that's true. Yep, that's the suspicious part for sure. So even though this is a story, this is a series more particularly focused on Wilson, we are going to be reporting and talking about the theology and political and cultural everything ideology behind these movements. Because although I think Wilson's closer to the root, there's many people who are closer to the root. You've done quite a bit on John MacArthur, who's kind of the poster boy for evangelicalism or conservative evangelicalism, at least the former poster boy. There may be newer poster boys now. Um, and there is a lot of parallels between MacArthur and Wilson, especially with how abusers are handled and the abused are handled. So how in your reporting of him and anybody else, I know Driscoll, I went to Mars Hill back in the day and I knew Driscoll and I knew plenty of others in his ilk.
I'm so
Um,
sorry.
yeah, yes. I drank the Kool-Aid, so it wasn't so much I was part of the abused, I was part of the abusers, which is unfortunate.
Mm.
Um, how are these abusers shielded? Like, what does that look like for, even if it's the minister himself or the minister who's covering for them? Like, why do they cover them? How is the shielding done? When you're reporting on this stuff, what do you see? What are the themes and the trends you see between those in power and how they cover over these stories too, and then they blame the victims?
Yeah. Well, what's so sad is that you have religious systems that are often described to me as operating like the mafia. The celebrity pastor is like a mob boss.
Mm-hmm.
those around him are just like, the hitmen, the men who do whatever the mob boss wants them to do. And if they don't, that mob boss has a way of enforcing
Yeah.
things, and it does seem like a lot of these people describe the church almost like, the Hotel California. You can leave anytime you, or you can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave.
Mm-hmm.
So take, for example, I'll do James McDonald first, but then we can talk about John MacArthur. It's the same sort of thing. Well, I'll talk about John MacArthur. In John MacArthur's case, look who's on his board. Who's on the board at Grace Community Church? It's a bunch of pastors at Grace Community Church. So, I mean, right there, you have men who rely on John MacArthur for their salary.
Yep.
Who are supposed to be holding him accountable. I mean, that's insane, right?
It's not going to work. Yeah.
It's not going to work. There's very few who are truly independent. Okay. Yeah. Then even if you look at the independent elders, for example, those are usually men that are in ministry or have ministry aspirations. It may be on the side, but they're men who will preach at church, and they maybe have a ministry, or they maybe spin off a ministry off of it, but they know, and this is the thing, because of the celebrity culture we live in and this whole evangelical industrial complex, the celebrity pastor has the power to destroy your ministry. And, I've seen it happen. Like, for example, I remember the longtime chairman of the board at Harvest Bible Chapel. He and his wife, mainly his wife, but he would help too. They did this entrusted ministry, which was, for families, teaching parents and discipling parents. And when they left Harvest, which they tried to do quietly, they tried to step off the board, not say anything. They just wanted, at that point, he had been there 20 years and had seen all the crap. And he was like, but I'm not going to fight it. I'm just going to leave. When they left, they had this entire conference set up in Romania with a church that had some ties to Harvest. Of course, it was an independent church, but it had ties. And James would come over and speak, and I think they might have even gotten money from Harvest Bible Chapel. But of course, that conference was completely, it was canceled. They were blacklisted within evangelicalism. It happened to me when I blew the whistle on Moody. I was blacklisted. All the conferences I had scheduled, ironically, to speak at a huge women's conference at Harvest Bible Chapel. Of course, that was canceled. All of the radio interviews about my book were canceled. Everything was canceled, and there's no way I would get a job in ministry. Of course, I knew that would happen. I get how it works. Yep. Like, you don't go up against the big guys. It's always David and Goliath. And so what you find is that most of the time they are just afraid to speak. And it is not, and this is the thing that bothers me too, is it is never one bad apple. And this is what people have to understand. It is a toxic system. And these churches are run more like, I would say, a lot of people would say like the mafia. That's probably the darkest way of viewing it. But even if you view it, as a legitimate business, it's still run like a business. They're run like a corporation. The values are money. The values are success. The values are, we're too big to fail. He's too big to fail. These are the sorts of things that are happening. But the boards are usually stocked with people who are, in the case of John MacArthur, his Grace to You board, I think he had maybe 5 trustees at the point that I first reported on him, or board members. And 2 of them were his own sons. One of his sons was actually the treasurer, so he's in charge of all the money. And the second, third, fourth part, full-time salary that John MacArthur would get for all of his ministries, every single one of them, Grace to You and the Master's Seminary and University and Seminary, they gave him a full-time salary, along with Grace Community Church, along with his books, along with his speaking. And what does he even do for the radio? Nothing. They just recycle his sermons that he was already paid for by the church. Why his intellectual property, he gets to make another buck on it? I don't understand. But that's how churches work. That's how radio ministries work. It's insane. That's a whole other rabbit trail. But yeah, again, the boards are stocked, and then their finances are obscured.
Hmm.
completely obscured. So you have Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, for example, became a church or an association of churches, because any religious nonprofit doesn't have to report an IRS 990 form. Every secular nonprofit has to file a form 990, and they have to state how much do their top three wage earners make at their organization. But if you're a church, you don't have to do that. So nobody knows what the pastor makes. Nobody knows what the men around him make. Nobody knows really how the money is spent. And I understand that when we started this, in this country, we probably were thinking we don't want the state involved in the matters of the church. Makes
Hmm.
sense. I have that value myself. But what we never envisioned were 30 to, in the case of Gateway Church, $150 million organization brings in $150 million in revenue a year. And there is no transparency. There is no accountability. There is nothing. And so that pastor, oh, wow, he has multiple multi-million dollar houses. How did that happen? Must be the books. I mean, come on, people. It's unbelievably frustrating. So these pastors have just an unbelievable amount of power. Now, if you want to talk, do you want me to talk about the specific ways, like the stories in which John MacArthur
Please,
has?
you could say whatever you want because this is tracking one to one with Doug Wilson. The same stuff we're seeing with Doug and his finances network. It's precisely the same thing. So keep going if you want to.
Okay. So then we find there's also often just a great deal of misogyny and patriarchy in these
Hmm.
churches. And there's a different standard for men than there is for women. I can't tell you how many people at John MacArthur's church who used to be on staff there or at the Master's Seminary said, Julie, the woman, it's always her fault. The woman
Hmm.
is always at fault. She is always wrong. So you have a situation where in the early 2000s, Eileen Gray, her husband is on staff. He directs the orchestra there at Grace Community Church, but he also teaches classes. At that point, they had a school, and he was teaching elementary school students. And Eileen comes forward because she finds out from one of her children. She had come out in the middle of the night of a horrible altercation, which I wrote about. But had wasn't sure what happened at the time, but eventually her children came forward and told her that her husband had tried to suffocate one of them, that he was regularly abusing them. They were showing all the signs of being abused. So she immediately went and got a protective order. And then she went to the church, thinking the church would hold him accountable and protect her. And initially they did do some things, found some people to help her, and I think even house her for a while till she felt it was safe to go home. And then David moved out of the house for a while, and then again she got this protective order. But then there was counseling that Grace Community Church did, and not only do I know this because Eileen told me this, but she sent the tapes of the counseling session to one of her pastors who heard. This was a pastor that she had from her hometown,
Hmm.
who heard the counseling sessions, and then actually wrote a statement for the court for her divorce proceedings that was entered in the court. And he talked about how Grace Community Church, the pastor there, was telling Eileen that her responsibility as a wife was to suffer, to be an example of how to suffer like Jesus for the children as her husband abuses her, to show them how to suffer like Jesus. Unbelievable. And then I had documentation, numerous letters that then Grace Community Church sent to Eileen, telling her and guilting her with all sorts of spiritual abuse, that it was her responsibility as a wife to take David back into her home. Again, they knew full well that he had been abusing her. He even confessed, and I got the written portions of his confession that he gave in counseling to some of the horrific things he did to his children. At this point, all we knew about was the physical abuse. But they knew about the physical abuse and they're pressuring her to drop an order of protection and take him back into her home. She gets multiple letters like this. If it eventually escalates, because she won't do it out of concern for her children, out of trying to protect her children. And what happens to her? John MacArthur gets up, publicly excommunicates her in front of the entire church. We have video of the excommunication service, and basically completely vilifies her and shames her in front of the church. She moves out of the area. About a year later, 2 years later, it comes out, as the children feel more and more safe, that they've been sexually abused, and they begin drawing pictures of what their father did to them. All of this, she then reported all of that to police. It becomes a legal case, and in 2005, David Gray was convicted of sexually molesting his children. He is still in prison for sexually molesting his children. He was up for parole, and the case was so slam dunk that they were like, there's absolutely no way you're getting parole. So that was like, a couple years ago when I reported this, I think 2022. What does John MacArthur and Grace do? You would think at this point they would say, I am so sorry, Eileen Gray, for what we did. This is absolutely horrific, that we put abuse upon abuse against you at a time when you needed the church the most and you needed us to protect you. But instead they do the exact opposite. They start supporting, David Gray says he has a ministry in prison. They start supporting him, and they continue to say he's wrongly accused and that Eileen Gray is a horrible woman for what she did to her husband, lying about him and getting him put in prison. Do you have any idea how hard it is to win a sex abuse case in California? She won. And if you've read the court documents, which are breathtaking, and I actually never reported on the trial, the sexual molestation trial, because it's to protect her children, because it was just so horrific what was there. But again, I know there were some people from Grace Community Church who went to that trial, who knew full well all of the documents were public, and they continued this because it was so, I believe it's because it was so humiliating to them that one of their own had done such a heinous thing, and they couldn't admit it. They had to keep this mantra. So that's not a one-off. There's another story, and I won't tell it in much detail, but a woman, Wendy Guay, who as a teenager, her father was a pastor at Grace Community Church. In fact, at one time, he was the executive director of Grace to You, John MacArthur's broadcast ministry. He sexually molested her repeatedly. She told a friend of the family. That friend of the family went in and with her father, Paul Guay, who was on staff, a pastor there, told John MacArthur in his office to his face, I have that man who heard the man confess, and John MacArthur say, I will take care of it. I will make sure this gets dealt with. I have that man wrote a complete testimony and signed it and notarized it to say, this is my testimony of what happened. So I have an eyewitness account of this happening. John MacArthur, I've got a handwritten note from John MacArthur saying to Wendy that her husband or her father is a wonderful man, and that he's really sorry for what he did, the molestation of his teenage daughter, and he will remain on staff, which he did for another 3 years, and that she should forgive him. This is a 1979 letter. This devastated her. Her entire life was marked by the sexual abuse, but it's never just the sexual abuse. It's the enabling, it's the covering up. That was the hardest thing for her to deal with. She struggled with eating disorders. She struggled with substance abuse. Finally, about a decade later, well, I should say, and no, it was more than a decade later. This was in like 2000. Actually, let me just double check. I don't want to misquote it. 2003. So the original abuse happened in 1979. 2003, Wendy learns that her father had sexually abused other family members, and she realized, oh, this wasn't a one-off, which again, it never is. He was a pedophile. And so then she writes John MacArthur and actually has a phone call with him, and we have. Basically, she was saying, we're going to go, because he was still pastoring, her father, Paul Guay, was still pastoring a church. And she wanted John MacArthur simply because of his position, because of his prominence, would you come and tell them what he did to me and be a witness of it? And John MacArthur, like the coward that he is, denied that he had ever heard a confession. And then he writes this email to her. And imagine your life, decades of your life have been destroyed, not just by your father molesting you, but by this celebrity pastor who never did anything about it, and let him continue to go on pastoring. And who knows how many people her father actually abused. He writes to her in an email in 2003, I'm not sure what more we can do. I'm not sure what more we can do to help you in your struggle. But we are able to pray for you and your family and your father. And then he says, I don't know why this has become such an obsession for you. Can you fathom the cruelty to do that? I mean, I honestly, I just can't fathom being that cruel to a human being who has been through so much. And yet I've reported all of this, and John MacArthur has had absolutely no consequences. All of this is public information, and he has had no consequences. Now, I'm sure, I'm not sure, but I would guess his giving to his ministries may have gone down, but I honestly don't know. And there seems to be plenty of people at this church. There seems to be Shepherd's Conference. People are still going, and all of the big names around him continue to fawn all over him and call him, the greatest expositor of the 20th century and, 21st century. It's just mind-numbing to me. It just makes me wonder, how many stories do we have to tell and expose? Or is this just, it's like some of the horrific things that we've seen Trump do, and it doesn't matter. People just don't care. They really just don't care. It's okay for them if he protected pedophiles. It's okay if he abused human beings. They don't care. It's okay with them. Which I just have to say, I don't know how these people can know Jesus Christ. I just don't, because that is not the heart of God, the God that I know and the God that's in Scripture.
Yeah. I'm going to slightly change the next question just because I think it better fits here. Because everything you're saying tracks with everything that we're going to come out with on Wilson, stuff that people don't know, stuff that people do know, but don't know the extent of it. And then just how pervasive this is within evangelical and reformed cultures. And I come from the reformed culture myself, and I've seen this in our contexts. And this may sound like a simple question, but I know for you, it's not a simple question. With all these reports coming out, it only seems like these celebrity pastors, in rare exceptions, is this not the case, that like they get more famous from these things. They get more clicks, so they get more downloads, they get more people come to the church, or more site traffic. And you don't see the law enforcement presence, you don't see litigation against them. I mean, at least that's not reported, or that's front facing. For lack of a better way of asking this, how do pastors like Wilson, like MacArthur, like McDonald, like Driscoll, how do they still stay alive? How does their ministry keep going, even though people know all of this stuff about them? Maybe if you can help out those listening, like what does it take to bring them down?
Well, I could cite stories where people have been removed and completely become pariahs within the evangelical world. I mean, I would say James MacDonald is one of them.
Okay.
Has been completely taken off the radio. He, only the most there's no respectable church that would have James MacDonald come and speak. And so I think there are examples like that. I think Ravi Zacharias, after the reporting that we did, exposing how Lorianne Thompson, this Canadian woman that he said tried to extort money from him, that it was not that at all, that actually he preyed on her and he was the sexual predator who abused her. And Christianity Today did some great reporting on the spas and the massage therapist that he sexually abused, and this pattern. And now RZIM, there's been accountability. Now this secret board that they have still holds on to millions of dollars that they had in reserve that nobody really understands what's going on with a lot of that. That's still cloaked. But we can see that there's been a real difference because of our reporting. And I would say there's Association of Related Churches. We've done dozens of stories on ARC pastors, and many of them have been removed. Many of them are done for. I mean, they're not returning. But ARC continues as one of the largest church planting organizations in North America, and there are still plenty of pastors within there who are involved in misconduct, and we will continue to report it as long as it takes. So, I mean, I think there are some really positive stories. I think the reason, though, and I remember people always say, this is a cult and they're not going to listen. And I'll often say, I'm really not reporting to convince the people within the cult or within the system. They will be the absolute last people who will accept the truth. But again, a lot of these pastors are propped up and maintained by the system, the evangelical complex, right? It's their network of pastors and ministries and stuff that support them. But I think a lot of it is tough because what they will do is they will discredit or do everything they can to make this into a spiritual battle. I have been called, a Jezebel, a daughter of Satan, every name you could think of. I must have horns and I must have a tail. I mean, for sure. And they will say that the most horrific things about you online publicly because you're the messenger, because they cannot. And honestly, I wish people would get it. The more they vilify you, they're doing that because they can't counter your reporting.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to go after the messenger. And so what I find is, I bet if you would take a poll right now, how many people in Doug Wilson's network of churches, how many of them have read the reporting on Doug Wilson?
Mm-hmm.
You'll find very few have. I think the same thing at John MacArthur's church. They're all told, I'm of the devil, and if you read that, you're a bad person.
Yep.
So they don't read what I write. They don't read, the evil mainstream media, what they may write. So they're able to, it's very, very cult-like. And if you're inside of this very controlling system, and what's the number one thing they tell you about totalitarian states? The first thing they have to control is the press. And that's what they've done. They've controlled the communication within their system. They've made people feel guilty for even listening to an outside voice. They've convinced them that we're of the devil and they're the anointed ones of God, and how dare you touch the Lord's anointed. These people are genuinely scared. And even beyond that, even if they don't buy that, they are so scared of the repercussions that might happen to them or their businesses or their family members or the people that are still on staff that they love and they know. I mean, it's this sort of thing that make it so that people, it's going to be interesting to see what happens when John MacArthur passes. It's going to be interesting because I've lost track of how many people have come forward to me with horrific stories who then say, but I can't say it now because my so-and-so, my uncle is on staff there, or my book that, is promoted by the Masters University, or I contributed to this commentary. I mean, there's so many people like that who I think when he's out of the equation, more and more and more and more and more is going to come forward. But as long as they're in power, as long as that fear is in place, people are silenced and people are just afraid to listen to the truth. And it's really, really tragic because so many people's lives are being just destroyed.
Yep. Yep. Very much so. So two concluding questions.
Mm-hmm.
You even said this yourself. You love the church. You love Jesus. And I think more often than not, people who don't like the reporting is like, no, Julie hates the church. She hates Jesus. She hates everything that conservative evangelicalism stands up to or stands up for. So how is reporting, or your reporting in particular, misunderstood? And what's your goal? Like, why produce abuse stories in the first place? Are you just trying to shake up people's trust in the church, or is there something else going on?
I do love the church. In fact, I can remember when I was reporting at Harvest, again, this was one of my first investigations. And I remember there was one former pastor who every time he would get off the phone after talking to me about this months long investigation, he would say, Julie, for the bride, for the bride. And he always kept that at the forefront. And for me, it's always been about that. It's been about being faithful to God, about being faithful to what he's called me to do. It really hasn't even been about the results, although I'm thrilled when when there's change because of my reporting. I'm thrilled when a survivor writes and talks about how she feels like she's not crazy anymore because we told her story or she read somebody else's story that was just like hers. And she's like, I'm not crazy. This happened. This is happening. They all told me that it wasn't, but it did. And so those are huge. And when you can impact people and bring justice and truth and healing to people, that's huge. And we do a Restore conference. We're having our 4th Restore conference in February in Phoenix, which really just grew out of a desire to minister to all of these wounded people that I would come in contact with, who just had such profound church hurt and often had checked out of church as a result. And our tagline for it is to restore faith in God and the church. That's what this is about. You know what, when people, they'll often be like, why do you air this dirty laundry?
Mm-hmm.
And as if God's biggest concern is our reputation, And I remember when I was very early on thinking of reporting some really damaging stories, and I was at our church, we were actually going through the prophets and going through studying the Babylonian captivity. And it struck me that if God didn't care about his own, he loved his own chosen people and he had a plan for them and a purpose, but he humiliated them in front of all the nations. These are the people he brought out of Egypt, right? They all knew that this was the God of Israel, right? That was his name, the God of Israel, right? God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now they're being exiled, they're being humiliated. And what struck me is God doesn't care about our reputation. He cares about his. And he doesn't care about us exposing people's sins as much as he does as people in his name behaving like this and saying that they're representatives of God. That is what makes God angry. When there is not a standard of holiness and justice in the church, and those who bear his name don't have compassion and love for the sheep, they don't serve the sheep, they prey on the sheep, nothing infuriates God more than preying on the vulnerable. And to do that in his name is such a deep offense that the last thing he's concerned about is some celebrity pastor's reputation. So I'm doing this to be faithful. It's been a crisis of conscience when I started. It continues to be something where I say to the Lord, I'm 59 right now. There's nothing about this that I'm like, oh, I can't stand to lose this, like it kind of, we publish in contrast to the people I report on, we publish exactly what I make. People can go look and see what I make.
Mm-hmm.
You can see where our money's spent. I'm not getting rich off of this. Our Restore conferences, we barely break even. We do this to honor God and to be faithful. And we trust him with the results. And at the end, I used to write music. And probably the song that I would get most comments on was one called Good and Faithful Servant, from that scripture. And I think that's what all of us, I would say, speaking for the team that I work with, is their heart is to hear, well done, good and faithful servant, and to be faithful. And I do believe that God will clean house. I think it's going to be painful. And I think we forget that the Reformation took over 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
So this is going to take a long time. It's not going to be fun, but I do believe that God is in it. And, he said the gates of hell won't prevail over his church. I think we're going to have to get back to doing church his way. I think what we've made out of it is a mockery of the gospel. It's a joke. And it's not a few bad apples. It really is systemic. We had somebody speak at our last Restore conference, and the title of his talk was it's the system, stupid. It really is. It's the system. It's the leadership culture that we have, where we make, scripture in the New Testament talks about leadership less than 10 times. It talks about servanthood and following hundreds of times. And we have forgotten that there's one leader in the church, and it's not your celebrity pastor, it's Jesus. And we got to get back to that. And we got to get back to being a church, of being an organic body, a family, not. And I've begun to really wrestle with, even if pastor is an office, it's a gift. It's certainly something that God raises people up to do, but they're meant to be shepherds. They're meant to be those who serve. It's not meant to be a title or an office that we give people deferential treatment. If anything, they're supposed to be giving the congregants the deferential treatment. That's what Jesus did. So I love the church. I have a holiness background. So there's probably, as I tend to be a Calvinist today, although, as George Verwer said, I had a mean streak of Arminianism in me.
Sure. Yeah.
But holiness means a great deal to me personally. And I think it means a great deal to God. The four creatures around his throne, they're not saying grace, grace, grace. They're not saying love, love, love. They're saying holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. And we've forgotten that. We serve a holy God. He expects his people to be holy. And it's time we remembered that.
Yeah. So building off that to the last question, concluding one.
Mm-hmm.
People who read your reports, or people who listen to the series, whatever it may be, Christians in particular, start with them, who are like, well, how can I ever trust the church again? How can I ever trust a pastor again? How can I ever trust a leader again? I see all this, like, I'm just now expecting the next one next week, another one a week after that, another one a week after that. So first, what might you say to them who are like, I don't know what I can do anymore? And then the non-Christian who looks at the church is like, yeah, why would I ever go to a church if that's the church, if that's what the church is known for? Why would I ever go there? So if you can speak to both the Christian and non-Christian who are looking at this abuse reporting and saying, yeah, I'm done. I'm not into this anymore. I can't trust them anymore.
Yeah. Actually, just within the past month, I spoke to a class at a Christian college, which is funny because the person who had me come in and speak, he's an adjunct professor and he's extraordinarily wealthy and he doesn't need this job and he couldn't care less if he gets fired. I'm like, I mean, you invite me to come in, but I'm going to speak the truth. He's like, go for it. And it was 2.5 hours and you could have heard a pin drop as I was speaking to that class. And that's exactly what I was asked at the end. One of the students said, my church that I grew up in, they fired the youth pastor and they kind of made some vague statement that doesn't make any sense. And we know there's more to it and they're not telling us what it is. How do we know we can trust our church? And I said to him, you don't. In fact, if they're not being forthright about what happened with your youth pastor, then I would not attend that church. I would not attend that church if they don't tell you how the finances are kept. I would not attend that church if they obscure what your pastor's salary is. And the truth is, I really do think we have to rethink how we do church. I'm in a house church right now. I never envisioned I would be in a house church. I love our house church. I love, and it's interesting because I said we were talking one time, and it's one of the things that we discuss as a group, like we don't have leaders per se right now. And one guy said, if we ever get a pastor, I'm out of here. And because so many people in this group have been really burned, right? And I'm not defending that. I'm not saying that's biblical. I'm just saying that's where people are at right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking to one of my board members about that, and he's a longtime church planter, and he thinks deeply about these issues. But he said, "Oh, you've got pastors. I bet you right now, if I asked you who's shepherding, you have people shepherding." I said, "Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, people are using their gifts. They're shepherding. But they just don't get a salary for it. They don't get position for it. They don't have more say than everybody else because they teach. We're all a family together." And so we're wrestling through. I mean, in fact, we have a retreat coming up where we're going to talk about, okay, should we have more structure? Should we have leaders? Are we, allowing Scripture to lead us, or the trauma of our past experiences? And there's enough safety in our group right now we can have that discussion. But I think these are the things we're going to have to start talking about. We're going to have to rethink how we're doing church. And so what I said to that guy in that class is, I said, "Listen, I'm 59. So I'm probably not going to shape the future of the church, but you are. And it's you guys who are going to have to make the church different. It's you guys who are going to have, again, this is not just the celebrity pastors, it's the consumer, right? Like the whole entire system dries up if people stop giving money to it. The whole entire system dries up if people stop voting with their feet and showing up. The whole thing. And it's about time that the people in the pews start saying, this is what church should look like. And unless you're going to run a church that's true to Scripture and to biblical values, then I'm not coming. And we're gonna form other churches. We are going to continue meeting together, but we're going to do it in a way that reflects the values that we see in Scripture, that reflects what Christ said this church should be. Not what some person in power told me how I'm supposed to interpret Scripture and how it needs to be in a very self-serving way so that system that they've set up continues to function. I'm not going to do that anymore. And so I do think education is huge. And there's one other thing I forgot to mention that I want to make sure that I do, is when you wonder why so many people look the other way, it's because our pastors have groomed people to look the other way. They have been conditioned by misapplication of Matthew 18, that whenever you see a sinning pastor, you've got to go to him one-on-one, even though that man holds way more power than you and can destroy you. You have to go one-on-one to him. And then you take another person with you if he doesn't hear you. And then you say it to the whole church, which of course, when you try to do that, the whole entire elder board absolutely obliterates you and your reputation. That's what we make people do because of a complete misunderstanding and misapplication of Matthew 18. We would actually, there's some places where they actually tell abuse survivors they need to confront their abuser.
Yep.
I mean, it's insanity. Understand, Matthew 18 is not for church leaders who are engaged in misconduct. 1 Timothy 5:20 is. That's where it says, for the elder who persists in sin, he should be exposed before everyone so that others may stand in fear. That is the Scripture for leaders. And yet, I have only heard one sermon in my entire life, and I have grown up in the church, and I've only heard one sermon on 1 Timothy 5:20. I have heard tons of sermon. guilting people about gossip, about slander, which most people don't understand. Slander has to be false. So it's not slander if it's true. Guilting people or telling people that your pastor is God's anointing or he's like Moses, which is absurd because that's an Old Testament model and we're in the New Testament. I mean, the whole thing is there has been an entire system and grooming in place where the average person in the pews does not understand their responsibility to hold their pastor and their leaders accountable. And they feel guilty when they do. And they misunderstand that their loyalty needs to be to Jesus, not to their pastor, not to their church. It's to God. It's to the mission of the church. So the loyalty is completely misplaced. To your question about the unbeliever, and this is the really tragic part, is that we've lost our witness in the world. We have zero moral platform right now. When I talk to unbelievers and they tell me how horrible Christians are, all I can do is look at them and say, we have done a miserable job of representing Jesus. And I am so, so sorry. That's all we can do. And I don't blame the unbeliever. In fact, I feel sorry that the unbeliever will still be accountable before God when we have given them so many reasons to discount who Jesus really is because we have not represented him. I'm convinced when people know Jesus, when they see Jesus for who he really is, he's I don't know who would reject him. He's so compelling. But we've done such a miserable job and we're going to be held accountable for it. All of us. And for what we've done with what we know. And if we've just looked the other way and been silent, we're going to be responsible for that too, even if we didn't participate in it. Our silence is evil too.